Good day. Today is Sunday, 5th January 2025, and I've mentioned in my previous video that we are now in the run-up to the Russian Orthodox Christmas, which is celebrated on Tuesday, and the result has been that we've had a certain reduction in information about the state of the war in Ukraine from both Russian and Ukrainian sources, until today, that is, which I will discuss shortly. And I've also said that despite that, fighting continues at an intensifying level, and that the Russian advance in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, continues to accelerate, and that efforts that were made to set up a Christmas truce by such people as Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary have been unsuccessful. Now, a couple of days ago, the Ukrainian military chief, General Syrski, visited Sudzha. He met with various Ukrainian officials there and Ukrainian military commanders. He gave out decorations to Ukrainian soldiers. He spoke about the fact that Ukrainian troops would be reinforced in the Kursk area, and a number of articles, in fact, have appeared in the Ukrainian media trying to convince us again of the immense importance of Kursk, how important Kursk is in the overall scheme of things for the Ukrainians, the kind of relevance it has for Ukraine, and why it is essential that Ukraine hold on to it. And it is indeed the case, as we shall see, that the Ukrainians have reinforced significantly in Kursk, and this morning news started to trickle through of a Ukrainian counterattack, the details of which I am going to discuss in a moment. Note, however, what is happening elsewhere along the main front lines over the course of the last couple of days. The Russians have captured Kursk. About that, there is no real argument or dispute. They've been capturing more and more villages around Pokrovsk. The German journalist Julian Repke says that the Russians have captured 8 villages close to Pokrovsk over the course of the last 8 days against minimal opposition. There are reports that the Ukrainian troops west of Selidovo, this crucial area which provides the shield for the Dnieper, that the Ukrainian troops in this area are weak and disorganized, that there are no strong fortifications. Yesterday, reports started to circulate that the Russians were in the process of storming the village of Dachny, west of Kursk, and that they'd started storming the small town of Velikaya Novosilka as well. There was lots of pictures of Velikaya Novosilka being bombed. And if you listen to what most military commentators, Western military commentators, but of course Russian and Ukrainian as well, say, this is the key battlefront. It's southwest Donbass. This is where the greatest threat to Ukraine lies. If Pokrovsk and Velikaya Novosilka are captured by the Russians, if the advance west of Selidovo continues, the way is open for the Russian forces to reach the Dnieper in central Ukraine, to advance into Dnipro region, reach the Dnieper itself, and do so in the area of the two great cities, the two great industrial cities of Zaporozhye, which the Russians claim is, of course, now a Russian city. It is the capital of one of the 4 regions that the Russians say is part of their country. And, of course, Dnipro, still the Russians acknowledge as Ukrainian. It was the location of the major missile strike with Oreshnik on the great Yuzhmash factory, missile factory that is located there. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians might, despite the fact that they still see Dnipro as a Ukrainian city, it might be that they're thinking ultimately of an advance towards Dnipro as well. And I have discussed in many programs, extending back for years now, that if the Russians arrive on the Dnieper in central Ukraine, if they manage to take control of this area of the Dnieper River, then Ukraine's whole economic viability starts to come into question. Its military abilities, its ability to continue military resistance is also in jeopardy as well. Now, there have been many reports, there have been reports I've been getting from a certain source that the Ukrainians have built or are in the process of building, with the help of their Western allies, a large network of fortifications on the west bank of the Dnieper. But I have to say that I'm also getting what I think ultimately are more plausible reports, that Syrski and Zelensky continue to insist on defending Ukrainian territory east of the Dnieper, and that the vast bulk of the Ukrainian army, the combat-ready brigades, are located on the east bank of the Dnieper. This fortified line on the west bank of the Dnieper, if it exists at all, is apparently, for the moment, very underdeveloped. But anyway, there we are. That remains what I understand the Germans call the Schwerpunkt, at least according to most military commentators. This is the region where, if the Russians make a breakthrough, if they reach the Dnieper in this area, it will be an enormous crisis for Ukraine, arguably an existential crisis. And by the way, if they cross the Dnieper in this area of central Ukraine, then that crisis will become, well, not just existential, it could very quickly become terminal as well, at least in terms of the Ukrainian state that exists today. Now, about a year ago, the Ukrainian magazine, Dissident magazine, very, very fine magazine, incidentally, and one that has tracked the war very well, Strana, which now I understand publishes from outside Ukraine. They discussed the state of the war. They were thinking, this is about a year ago, that the situation still overall was in a certain kind of stalemate, that the Russians hadn't yet achieved a breakthrough. But they did itemize certain events which would indeed call into question the existence of the Ukrainian state. And one of them, as I well remember, was the capture of Zaporozhye and Dnipro, the two cities. And obviously we're not there yet. Maybe we will never get there. But the Russians are within visible range, if you like, of reaching those two cities. Strana, which I take very seriously, thought that this would be a terminal crisis for Ukraine if those two cities fell. I entirely agree. Well, it seems that one person who doesn't agree, or maybe two people who don't agree, are Zelensky and Syrski, because even as this operational crisis for Ukraine in this existentially important territory continues to develop, there have been more reports this morning of further Russian advances. A village, apparently an important village called Petropavlovka, has now apparently passed entirely under Russian control. Another village called Yelizavetivka, which I understand is in the territory of Vozdvizhenka, has also passed under Russian control. This is in the area of Kursk. Well, even as this operational crisis for Ukraine develops, what do? They reinforce failure. They start another offensive in the Kursk region. In fact, in the very Kursk pocket where things have gone so badly wrong for them. Now, there is, in my opinion, absolutely no military logic to any of this at all. I have discussed the Kursk area in many programs, extending all the way back to August. I've pointed out that this is a poorly inhabited, rural area of Western Russia, made up of rivers and forests and very small villages. There are no great industrial facilities here, and no enormously important facilities that Ukraine would be able to capture, apart from the Kursk nuclear power plant in Kurchatov, and, well, there's reports that there's a major depository of tactical nuclear weapons, at least warheads of tactical nuclear weapons, in that area as well. Beyond that, of course, there is the important city of Kursk, which is important, but which is a city of about 1 million people, far beyond Ukraine's ability to capture, or so I assume. So, the Ukrainians, when they launched their operation in Kursk in August, as I pointed out at the time, can only have had one objective, which was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant and perhaps the depository with the tactical nuclear weapons. Well, they failed. That operation failed. They got bogged down in street fighting for several days in the small town of Sudzha, the small border town of Sudzha. The Russians were able to reinforce in the area. There are some theories that they were laying a trap for the Ukrainians in the area. One way or the other, the entire operation in Kursk region, it became clear to me after the first week, or perhaps second week, I'm not sure now, had lost its purpose. Nonetheless, this morning, even as the Russians have shrunk the Kursk pocket to perhaps a third of its former size, we see the General Syrski's visit of a couple of days ago, the visit where he was handing out the decorations and making all of the promises, was a precursor to what we are learning about today. This morning, the Ukrainians have launched a counterattack in Kursk region. And it has apparently happened in the area of a rather large village called Bolshoye Soldatskoye, big soldiers, just to say, which is located on the main road from Sudzha to Kursk, to the city of Kursk. And the place that has been attacked is a small village called Berdin. The Ukrainians have apparently advanced towards it from the territory of the two villages of Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye, and the Russian Defense Ministry has now given us its own update as to what has happened. And it says this: over the past 24, it says this, that over the past 24 hours, the Ukrainians, seeking to achieve some kind of a attempt to try and stop or slow down the Russian offensive in Kursk region, have gone on an attack of their own. At around 9 a.m. Moscow time, In order to stop the offensive by the Russian troops in Kursk direction, the enemy launched a counterattack by an assault detachment consisting of 2 tanks, 1 counter-obstacle vehicle and 12 armoured vehicles with paratroopers towards Berdin. Artillery and aviation of Group of Forces North defeated 1 assault detachment. 2 tanks, 1 counter-obstacle vehicle and 7 armoured vehicles were neutralised. Presumably that means they were destroyed. The operation to neutralise the Ukrainian units is in progress. Now, we've had a lot of contradictory information from various bloggers and reporters about what is taking place on the battle lines at the moment. There is the usual fog of war. Some Ukrainian officials, Mikhailo Podolyak, for example, appear to be talking about good news and big advances towards Bolshaya Soldatskaya. Russian reports, these are not official Russian reports. They are reports from all the various bloggers and reporters getting information from the front lines of the soldiers who are fighting, and indeed from aviation units who have been deployed to the battle. They're coming back and they're saying that, in fact, the entire Ukrainian attack towards Berdino has been a complete failure, that the Ukrainians sent at least 2 waves of assault troops towards Berdino, that the Russian Air Force was able to catch them all in the open, that at least 20 vehicles, according to one claim from one Russian Air Force soldier in the area, at least 20 Ukrainian vehicles have been destroyed, and the attack, as of the time of making this program, has been a complete failure. The Russians, however, the same bloggers and commentators who are making these claims, however, also say that they don't think the battle has ended. They believe that the Ukrainians have concentrated significant forces in Kursk and Sumy region, that General Syrsky deployed these significant forces in support of this offensive, and they expect the offensive to be renewed. There is also speculation that the attack towards Berdino and ultimately Bolshaya Soldatskaya is a diversionary attack, that the main Ukrainian attack is going to come somewhere else. There's rumours, there's speculation that it might come again in the western part of Kursk region, where the Ukrainians attempted an offensive before towards the village of Glushkovo. This was a much discussed battle that was prepared by the Ukrainians some months ago. It completely failed, but there's some suggestions that the Ukrainians might try to attack in that area all over again. And there are also other theories that, in fact, the main blow isn't going to come in Kursk region at all, that the Ukrainians are planning some kind of an attack in some other place, against Bryansk region, against Kharkiv region, other places, against Belgorod region to be more precise. Conceivably and possibly that there might be a further Ukrainian attempt in the Zaporozhye region, far away in the south, another attempt by the Ukrainians to storm and capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Well, there's a lot of rumours and a lot of speculation, and I'm not going to get into it today at this of the time of making of this program. More likely than not, by the time this video is published, there will be a lot more clarity as to what it is exactly that the Ukrainians are trying to do. But for the record, the claims that the Russians are making at the moment, or at least, and I stress these are not official claims, these are from the various reporting channels and bloggers and people of that kind, the claims that they are making that the advance towards Bolshoye Soldatskoye has been a failure, that the Ukrainians failed to capture the village of Berdino. I think these reports are probably true. I think if the Ukrainians had captured Berdino by now, we would be having more reports or confirmation of this. And the Russian Defense Ministry report says that the Ukrainians, the Russian Defense Ministry report, of course, also says that the attack has been countered and that the Ukrainians, in launching this counterattack, what they're basically trying to do is to try to stop the ongoing Russian offensive. And there might be some reason for this, because as I've discussed in recent programs, following the capture of the small village of Agronom, immediately to the south of Suja, the Russians are within apparently about 2 kilometers of the metropolitan area of central Suja. And there are reports also that the Russians are now very close again towards capturing or recapturing the bitterly fought over village of Malaya Lochnia. In fact, there's reports this morning that even as the Ukrainians have been conducting an attack towards Berdino, somewhat to the east, the Russians have been attacking Malaya Lochnia, not that far away from where all this fighting is taking place, by the way. Anyway, there's reports that Malaya Lochnia itself might fall, in which case the area to the north of Malaya Lochnia would presumably have to be abandoned by the Ukrainians, and the Kursk pocket will have shrunk dramatically further still, to the point perhaps when it's starting to become undefendable. Well, that's what the Russians are saying. So that might suggest that this offensive, this counteroffensive, is indeed connected to the fighting in Kursk region. It is indeed centered on Kursk region, that these more elaborate or wider plans for offensives in Bryansk and Belgorod and against the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant are basically stories, maybe to keep the Russians guessing, and that in fact it is indeed, the purpose is indeed to try to halt the Russian advances in Kursk region, which, as I said, is what the Russians, judging from the Defense Ministry report, appear to believe. Now, if that is so, why would that be the case? As I said already, the Kursk offensive, way back in August, was already, in terms of achieving its objectives, a failure. The clear objective, and I've no doubt about this, and the Russians repeatedly say so, was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant and the depository. This, by now, must be out of reach. The Russians have established strong fortified positions around it. They have large numbers of troops in the area. There is no realistic way that the Ukrainians can capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. Whatever happens in Berdino or Bolshoye Soldatskoye, even if the Ukrainians capture that particular village, it's not going to change the dynamic in the Kursk region at all. I would add that Bolshoye Soldatskoye is on the main roads between Suja and the city of Kursk, which means that the Russians can send reinforcements down it to this precise area where this counterattack is taking place rather quickly. So, given that the Kursk operation has already failed, why are the Ukrainians apparently always allowing for the possibility that this is a diversion and something even more ambitious is intended. Why are the Ukrainians doubling down on it? Why aren't they? Why are they continuing to send reinforcements to this area precisely, where they have experienced nothing but failure, rather than send reinforcements to the front which really matters, which is the one in southwestern Donbass, where Velikaya Novosilka is likely to fall very soon, where the fortified positions the Ukrainians have west of Kurakovo look like they're going to be surrounded fairly soon as well, where Pokrovsk is being systematically and rapidly encircled and could plausibly fall fairly soon, where if the Russians advance west towards the Dnieper, it will be a massive crisis for Ukraine. I would add that if you are Syrsky and Zelensky, even if you've decided to write off the whole of southern Donbass, even if you're prepared to be relaxed about the fact that the Russians could reach the Dnieper, if you believe that the loss of cities like Zaporozhye and Dnipro isn't that important, well, it still seems to me that there are other places which matter a great deal and which the Ukrainians ought to perhaps be sending their reinforcements to. What about the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka area? The last big urban conurbation still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. The Russians have captured more than 90% of the city, of the town of Toretsk. The entire fortified position that the Ukrainians created in Toretsk is about to collapse, probably will collapse at some point this month. In Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians have fought a relentless defense, but there also, it seems to me that the situation is becoming very difficult. The Russians apparently have absorbed all the various Ukrainian counterattacks. With every Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians come back and gradually gain more ground. And, well, Chasiv Yar, relatively small place, but apparently seen by the Ukrainians as crucial. I suspect it's turned into something of a cemetery, a graveyard for many brave Ukrainian soldiers, the many Ukrainian soldiers tasked with defending it. But here perhaps you could argue that a defense makes sense. A defense in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka makes sense. Try to defend these places at least in advance of any negotiations that might begin. That might make more logical sense. But instead, what you're doing is focusing on the Kursk region, where you have already failed. Well, why are you doing this? The official reason, and Zelensky has just given an interview about this, he continues to insist that Kursk region, it's important to hold on to Kursk region because it is a bargaining chip with the Russians in negotiations. But Putin has consistently said that this is not so. In fact, at one point he was saying that there can be no negotiations with the Ukrainians at all while they remain in occupation of even a millimeter of territory in Kursk region. Under systematic pressure from his erstwhile friends, Brazil, India, China, in light of things that have been said by Donald Trump, he's to some extent walked that back, but not very far. He still says that there can be no substantive shift in the Russian position, no real talks with the Ukrainians on any substantive point while the Ukrainians remain in Kursk region. And the Russians have categorically said that they're not prepared to trade a millimeter of territory in Kursk region for any other territory, any of the territory that they have captured in any other place. Group of forces north, who are after all the people who are defending Kursk region, have, by the way, also commented about this, not recently, some months ago. And they said that the whole premise that Kursk region can be held as a bargaining chip to extract from the Russians other territories is an absurd one. This is a poor, thinly inhabited region made up of forests and streams and tiny villages. It cannot be compared in economic importance to the territories that Ukraine apparently is seeking to trade it with, places in Zaporozhye, Kherson, and elsewhere. And besides, whatever the Ukrainians are doing today, the Russians are confident that sooner or later Kursk region will come back through military means under their control. After all, they're winning the war. So Zelensky says this, but it can't be true. Perhaps he believes it, but if he does believe it, he's persuaded only himself. The theory, the argument that was floated by many Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky himself, that the Kursk offensive was compelling the Russians to divert vast forces from the main battlefronts. Well, that has been discredited so completely and comprehensively by so many people, myself included, by the way, that I don't really need to go over that ground all over again. So, why then cling on to Kursk region? Well, I'm going to suggest that, again, the explanations are psychological. They have more to do with the strange, well, maybe it's not so strange, the thinking inside Kiev than anything else. Firstly, if the Ukrainians are pushed out of Kursk region, if they are seen to be defeated there, if they retreat from Kursk region, then that is an admission that the operation has failed. And it's been suggested, it was suggested way back in August, that Zelensky's government, that Zelensky himself might not survive that, given the extent to which he has linked his own prestige with the Kursk operation. Now, I think that is quite plausibly true. The second reason, and I think this is again a psychological one, but it's one not to be wholly discounted, is that, of course, if the Kursk region fails, then Zelensky is again going to be confronted with the question of what was it then all about? Why was this offensive in Kursk region launched at all? And when I say confronted, I mean he's going to have to confront himself with that question as well. And of course he's come up, as I said, with all kinds of varying explanations, and it's quite likely by now that he's come to believe some of them. People do. When they invest in a particular project, they come up with all kinds of rationalizations as to why they should continue with it, even beyond the point when it has obviously failed. It's an example, if you like, or a feature, if you like, of the sunk costs fallacy, that you have to go on investing in something that has already failed, because if you don't, well, all your previous losses are indeed lost, and you're not going to recoup anything back from them. So just go on doing it. Come up with reasons why you have to do it. Talk yourself into believing those reasons, and that makes you dogmatic and prevents you from rethinking and being more logical with yourself about all of this. But I maintain that the biggest reason of all, the single reason most probably, which explains this obsession with clinging on to Kursk region, is the fear that if the Ukrainian foothold in Kursk region is lost, the very large Russian forces on the northern fronts will be released, and they will be able to resume and advance towards Kiev. They would be able to advance towards Kiev a second time. And this was the nightmare that Zelensky lived through in the first weeks of the war, when, as I said, the Israeli Prime Minister, former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has told us that he was hiding in a bunker and was terrified that the Russians were coming for him. And I think he doesn't want to relive that. And I think he's convinced himself that pouring men and machines into the Kursk pocket is his way of preventing that from happening all over again. Let me state clearly that I think that this is profoundly wrong. Whatever damage a withdrawal from Kursk would do to Zelensky's prestige, and I accept he might not survive it politically, but whatever damage he's doing to his prestige, whatever problems there are explaining what has happened to the Ukrainian people, whatever fears and insecurities clinging on to Kursk satisfies, the reality is that Kursk is proving to be a disaster for the Ukrainian war effort. Men and machines, valuable men and machines, are being diverted from other fronts to try to hold on to worthless territory, even as the Russians close in on the Dnieper. It makes absolutely no sense. It made no sense in August unless the Ukrainians had been successful in capturing the Kursk nuclear power plant, which they failed to do, and it makes even less sense now. In fact, it makes far less sense now. After all, Putin himself has made a claim, one which I've never seen contradicted, that the amount of material, tanks, armoured vehicles, and the rest that Ukraine has lost in Kursk region since the offensive there began in August has been greater than the total amount of material that Ukraine lost in its summer offensive in 2023. And that, if true, and of course this is only Putin telling us this, if true, and I'm not seeing it contradicted, by the way, if true, that would perhaps underline how catastrophically misjudged this whole Kursk operation from Zelensky's, from Ukraine's point of view, has been. Anyway, there it is. Another Ukrainian attack in Kursk is not the only Ukrainian escalation that there has been over the last couple of days. A few days ago, on the 3rd of January, as the Russian Defense Ministry has also told us, the Ukrainians launched another ATACMS missile strike inside Russia on Belgorod region. This is the Russian Defense Ministry account of what happened. On 3rd January, the Kiev regime attempted to deliver a missile strike by US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles at Belgorod region. In the course of an air defense battle, S-400 SAM systems and Pantsir SM crews shot down all the ATACMS missiles. The actions of the Kiev regime, supported by Western curators, won't go unanswered. Another 8 ATACMS missiles, apparently, shot down. We're told that the actual number of missiles that the Ukrainians launched, I've seen this in other sources, was actually 8, and the Russians managed, by their account, which no one is contradicting, to shoot all of them down. There is no pictures. There are no pictures of any damage done by these ATACMS. So I assume that this report from the Russian Ministry of Defense is true. A couple of days ago, about a week ago, the New York Times said that when the final decision to launch the ATACMS missiles into Russia was made back in November, when the decision that the Biden administration, as it now turns out, had made in the spring, was finally put into effect in November. By that time, Ukraine only had about 50 ATACMS missiles left. Well, I've lost track of the number of ATACMS missiles that Ukraine has launched into Russia since then. My rough guess is that it's around 25 or 30. If it is indeed the case that Ukraine only had 50 ATACMS missiles at that point, and that article in the New York Times looked as if it was fairly well founded, fairly well sourced, then perhaps half or more of them have gone and have achieved nothing at all of any value. The only real damage done to the Russians as a result of these missile strikes into Russia was done by one strike with Storm Shadow missiles, which did hit a target, though the Russians claimed that only limited damage was done in that attack as well. And incidentally and interestingly, we have had no more Storm Shadow strikes on Russia since then. And one does wonder why. Maybe there just aren't enough of them left. Anyway, that's one. That was another event. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry says that this attack with the ATACMS, despite the fact that it was completely unsuccessful, will not go unanswered. And by the way, I should quickly add that though we were told about a week ago that there were only 50 ATACMS left out of the 500 that had been delivered, that was in November, and given the way in which the Biden administration has sought escalation wherever it can, I would not be surprised at all if there's been more deliveries of ATACMS missiles, further depleting the US stockpile, perhaps to critical levels, but the Biden people don't seem to be particularly worried about that. Anyway, I would not be surprised if another 50 or 100 or perhaps even more have been sent to Ukraine since then, in which case this could continue until Trump becomes president, when, based on what he has said, he will finally put this to a stop. But anyway, this attack on Belgorod, perhaps related to this offensive in Kursk, who's to say? But it brings me back to this vexed question of Russian red lines, because, to repeat again, these attacks with these missiles on Russian territory most definitely are red lines. The Russians have said so. Putin himself has said so. They've said that they judge this to be an act of war, and from their perspective, you can see why they would think that. So, from their point of view, this has been a major violation of a red line. And the Russians have responded to that. They've launched missile strikes on Ukraine using the Oreshnik. They launched the attack on the Yuzhmash factory. And as I've discussed in a long series of programs, I have come round to the view that that was actually as devastating a strike as Putin says, that the Oreshnik almost certainly did use warheads that were powerful, that used some kind of advanced explosive metal compound or alloy. So it would be a mistake to say that the Russians have not responded at all. But I've also said that the Russians have had some reason to hold back on further escalation, because Donald Trump has signaled that he vehemently disagrees with the policy of missile strikes against Russia, which means, on the face of it, that the president-elect of the United States, the man who will become president of the United States in 2 weeks' time, has acknowledged the Russian red line, and that he's going to stop these very provocative attacks, given which a strong case can be made that since the missile attacks on Russia have been completely ineffective, the Russians, despite the violation of the red line, their red line, have a reason to exercise restraint. But anyway, this whole topic brings me back to the subject of red lines, because Jeff Roberts, the historian, has forwarded to me an article which appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine on 3rd January 2025 by Michael Poznansky and William Wolforth, which is entitled "The Real Risks of Escalation in Ukraine. Critics of Washington's gradualism are misreading Putin's red lines." Now, I'm not going to read this article, which is behind a paywall, but basically what it says is this: that the Russians have red lines. The Biden administration has repeatedly breached them, but it has breached them in a gradual, incremental way. And the reason it has done that is because it is engaging in salami slicing. In other words, it's breaching red lines in ways that it would be counterproductive for the Russians to respond to too strongly, which makes possible further limited escalations further along. In other words, it gradually erodes the Russian red lines. And Poznansky and Wolforth, the reason they've written this article is basically in order to defend Biden and the current administration from the charge that Ukraine is in the present situation in which it is because the administration, the current administration, has slow-walked military aid to Ukraine because they are too concerned, they're over-concerned by Putin's threats, and that what they should have done instead was call Putin's bluff, and they should have sent far more weapons, far more powerful weapons. They should have sent ATACMS missiles and heavy tanks and armoured vehicles and fighter jets to Ukraine way back in the spring of 2022. And then the situation would have been altogether different. And Poznansky and Wolforth says that this would have been a huge mistake. That kind of escalation would undoubtedly have been seen by the Russians as a major crossing of a red line. And had the United States escalated in that kind of way, then the Russian retaliation would have been much, much more severe, and we might indeed have found ourselves in a situation where we were sliding towards some kind of outright confrontation between these two nuclear-armed superpowers. Well, I have to say that I don't actually agree with the facts of this article. About salami slicing, that has taken place a great deal. It started right from the moment the Cold War ended. The United States and the Western powers, as I very well remember, had given categorical promises to the Soviets and to the Russians, not only that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO beyond Eastern Germany, but that there would be no military bases, no NATO military bases established in Eastern Europe, no military facilities established in Eastern Europe. In fact, according to my own recollection, which on this I think, by the way, is accurate, NATO would not even establish military facilities, military infrastructure on the territory of Eastern Germany, the former German Democratic Republic, even after it became part of the new Germany. Just saying, those were the promises, as I remember, that were made then. And many of these promises were backed by formal agreements. There was an agreement, for example, this is never acknowledged, but there was agreement with Ukraine itself that it would remain neutral. The fact was enshrined, as I recall, in Ukraine's own constitution. And all kinds of other things were agreed at that time. And of course, there was all sorts of treaties, arms control treaties that underpinned the whole system. There was the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. There was the INF treaty, which prohibited the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces, nuclear missiles in Europe. All kinds of treaties, agreements, promises that were made at that time. And, well, salami slicing began almost immediately. Gradually, from 1994, Western US policy shifted, reversed completely. They started to extend NATO eastwards in an increasingly purposeful way. They extended NATO into the territory of the former Soviet Union in the early 2000s, when the 3 Baltic states were included in NATO. The anti-ballistic missile treaty was scrapped. NATO, US anti-ballistic missile interceptors bases were created in Eastern Europe, on the territory of Poland and Romania, violating 2 agreements that there would be no military infrastructure established in Eastern Europe, and of course violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and scrapping the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Anyway, all of that was done at that time. And of course, the point about these bases is that, as the Russians have repeatedly pointed out, they could be easily converted to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are strategic nuclear missiles that could reach Moscow itself from these bases. So anyway, all of that was going on, and all kinds of other things were going on as well, and salami slicing was relentless. And far from this being effective in the way that Poznański and Wolforth suggest, what it did was that it poisoned relations between Russia and the West. The Russians became increasingly furious. They felt that they were being repeatedly lied to and betrayed, and they never ceased to make that point now. And they say that in light of what has happened, they cannot trust the West any further. And at some point back in 2008, 2007, 2008, they said enough is enough. Any further eastward extension of NATO into Ukraine will cross a red line, and at that point, Russia will respond to it. And that red line, the Russians have stuck by ever since. And they've stuck by that since, and it's caused a war. And we're talking about Ukraine itself and the conflict there. Again, one of the interesting things about Poznański and Wolforth in their article is that, like so many Western commentators about Russian red lines in terms of the conflict in Ukraine itself, they never mention any. They never actually say what the red lines that the West has crossed, that the Russians have set, are. Or to be more precise, they provide no actual quotes from Russian officials which they can use, and from Putin himself in particular, which they can use to say, this is a red line and we have crossed it. The only exception is the missile strikes on Russia, which the Russians have indeed said is a red line. Now, the Russians did set out various red lines about Ukraine before the start of the special military operation. NATO membership, that has always been there. An attack on Crimea. An attack on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. And though they never actually, to my recollection, said that the West should not arm Ukraine, they made it very, very clear that they took any arming of Ukraine by the West, this is before the start of the special military operation, very seriously, and that it would cause them grave concern. Well, these were Russian red lines. And we see that NATO has continued to insist that Ukraine will one day be part of NATO. NATO, the Western powers, the United States, did start arming Ukraine. In fact, as I understand it, as I've been told by a source, the United States itself covertly started to arm Ukraine, even during the last months of Barack Obama's presidency, despite Obama's own policy being that Ukraine should not be armed. Just saying. Anyway, the West started to do that. The Minsk agreements were, of course, never satisfied. The shelling of Donetsk city never fully ceased. There was a build-up of Ukrainian forces close to Donetsk and Lugansk in 2021, which continued into 2022. Zelensky himself signed off on a new policy paper in 2021, which allowed Ukraine, or authorized Zelensky himself and the government of Ukraine, to take back control of the Donbass by force. And of course, in the winter of 2022, in February 2022, heavy shelling along the contact line began. That is a topic that hardly anybody ever talks about anymore, even though the Russians expressed severe concerns about this. They were greatly worried, and I think that these worries, again, one shouldn't assume that they were just making this all up. The Russians said at the time that they were worried that this indicated another Ukrainian offensive to try to roll over Donbass, definitely a Russian red line. And of course, all of this happened over and above what had already happened the previous year in 2020, when a fairly transparent color revolution attempt was made in Belarus, and where, according to Putin and Lukashenko, something that has been barely reported and never contradicted, an attempt was made, or rather a plan was hatched, to assassinate Lukashenko himself. So, all of these red lines were being violated in various ways. Some of it, no doubt, was incremental. But the fact is that the Russians eventually enforced their red lines. As Putin has pointed out, they started the special military operation. Now, those are actual Russian red lines. Everything else that you hear about, talked about as red lines, about supplies of tanks and supplies of armoured vehicles and supplies of fighter jets and long-range missiles and HIMARS missiles. To repeat again, these were self-imposed red lines that the Biden administration and the Western powers imposed on themselves. The Russians obviously always said that they would see such moves as escalatory, but I never remember them saying, until they said that missile strikes on their own territory were a red line. I never remember them saying that any of these other things were, for them, a red line. I would add that one red line they did say was that if Western troops participated directly in the fighting, that would cross a red line. But what the Russians have always said is that in that case, they would treat those troops as combatants and they would launch attacks upon them despite whatever greater risks of escalation there might be. So there it is. This whole topic of red lines is very confusing because some people have made it confusing because they want to pretend that Putin is someone who always bluffs and that the Russians are always bluffing, and therefore we can do whatever we want and call the Russians bluff because they're just bluffing. We can escalate to an unlimited extent, and there is really no danger in doing it. Well, as I said, that simply isn't true. When the Russians felt that their red lines were being crossed in Ukraine, they responded by launching the special military operation, initiating a war which they are now in the process of winning and which the West is in the process of losing. Now, this brings us back to the other point that Poznansky and Wohlforth say, which is that the incremental supplies of weapons to Ukraine was simply the Biden administration engaging in salami slicing to undermine Russian red lines. But if those red lines don't exist, never existed, then the whole salami slicing theory really doesn't hold. And that brings me back to what exactly that the Biden administration was up to in Ukraine. Now, one thing that Poznansky and Wolforth do say is that people who continue to demand that the United States provide Ukraine with more and more and more military aid never consider logistics, industrial capabilities, technological capability, the extent to which these weapons, it's possible, it is physically possible to supply these weapons at all. There is always the assumption that they can be supplied in unlimited numbers, as if this is the 1940s and the United States is the world's biggest industrial power and can churn out weapons in infinite numbers without having a sweat. We have seen over the last 3 years that simply is not true. In fact, we're getting articles now from people like Eldridge Colby and the other article in the Financial Times that I discussed a short time ago, talking about how the United States is now an overextended superpower, that it's running down its inventories in Ukraine to dangerous levels. It can't go on providing weapons at the level that it once did. But that brings me back anyway to the question of why the Biden administration, quite apart from the supply issue, has supplied weapons, not incrementally, actually in very great quantities, but never, of course, in the quantities that would have been needed to win the war. And the reason for that is because there was no quantity of weapons that the United States had it within its power to supply that would have been sufficient to win the war. Now, here we come back to what the Biden administration was up to. In the first couple of weeks of the war, Ukraine was able to put up a stiff fight because it had a large arsenal of weapons already, which it had built up over the previous 8 years, large supplies of weapons supplied from Eastern Europe to make up the losses of the 2014 fighting. The Ukrainians had also received, as became clear, very, very large stocks of Javelin and Stinger missiles from the United States, supplies that had already started to flow, undoubtedly, before the start of the special military operation. The assumption was that those weapons, that Ukrainian army would be sufficient to bring the Russians to a standstill. And the further expectation was that the massive sanctions that the United States and the Western powers had initiated in February 2022 would be enough to crush the Russian economy. I read reports that GDP would fall by about half, just saying, that there would be a political crisis in Moscow, that the Russians would be brought to heel very, very fast. And then, of course, that didn't happen. The Russian economy remained broadly stable. It began to adapt to the sanctions shock far more quickly than had been anticipated. And to the alarm of some people in the West, including the Biden administration, the Ukrainians in March, sensing that the odds on the battlefronts were against them, began to sue for peace. And we ended up with the Istanbul Agreement. And then, of course, at that point, the Biden administration changed its approach. It started to send more weapons to Ukraine. And it continued to send weapons, and it got the Eastern Europeans to send still more weapons, large numbers of T-72 tanks from Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, air defense missiles, all kinds of weapons were being sent to Ukraine at that time, as I very well remember, in very, very large quantities, backed by HIMARS rocket systems and the M777 howitzers and other things. And of course, the point about it was that it was assumed that that would be enough, that the Russian army would be defeated with all of these weapons. And in fact, these weapons were used by Ukraine to conduct its two offensives in the autumn of 2022. Now, those offensives were partially successful in that they did push the Russians back, but not sufficiently successful to force the Russians to change their stance. There was a meeting, as I remember, in Istanbul, no, not in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Turkey, between Bill Burns, the CIA director, and Sergei Narishkin, the head of the SVR. And the Americans came away shocked from finding that the Russians weren't budging an inch. Anyway, at that point, the decision was made to escalate again, because there had been partial success in the offensives in the autumn of 2022. They'd not achieved the outcome. There'd been no decisive victory over the Russians. The Russian forces in Kherson region had not been trapped on the west bank of the Dnieper, which is apparently the plan. So in light of all of this, it was decided to try another offensive all over again. And this time, the decision was made to start supplying tanks and armoured vehicles, hundreds of Bradleys, 31 Abrams tanks, large numbers of other Western tanks, not just Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s, but also still more Soviet-era tanks sent in huge quantities to Ukraine in the winter and spring of 2022-2023, all with the intention of carrying out the offensive which would finally defeat the Russians and end the war on the Biden administration's terms, which is, of course, the offensive in the summer of 2023. The offensive towards the Sea of Azov, the one that was supposed to capture Tokmak and Mariupol and split the land bridge and encircle Crimea. And that offensive failed. And what did the Biden administration do? When that offensive failed, when its results had been even more disappointing than the failed offensive of autumn 2022, they again stepped up supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Fighter jets, which up to then it had been said would never be supplied, F-16 fighter jets. There's lots of doubt about how effective those would be. But anyway, they were supplied. The decision was made in the autumn of 2023 to supply them. The decision was also made to supply ATACMS missiles, 500 of them. 500 ATACMS missiles were sent. More and more air defense systems were sent as well. More Bradleys were sent. All kinds of things were sent. And, of course, another attempt at an offensive was made in the winter. This time, the amphibious offensive across the Dnieper River towards Crimea, the one that collapsed almost immediately in the village of Krinky. We have only very recently come to understand how ambitious that operation was, and though the British obviously played the leading role, the United States was obviously party to it as well. So, in no conceivable sense, in my opinion, can it be said that the Biden administration has held back on arms supplies to Ukraine. On the contrary, it has supplied as many weapons as it can, taking into account the need to preserve some American stockpiles, and also to ensure that the weapons supplied to the Ukrainians were weapons that they could absorb, because of course the Ukrainian army had to be repeatedly trained and retrained to use these weapons, and that takes time. So there has been no salami slicing that I can see. There's been only much more limited crossing of red lines. When people talk about red lines, they need to be precise about what red lines they mean. They need to cite actual statements by Russian officials that some of the things they say are red lines, Russian red lines, really were Russian red lines. Just saying. But I've seen no sign that the Biden administration held back from doing anything like that. What we have seen instead is a steady process of escalation, as every earlier escalation failed. It is exactly the same, if you know your history, with what happened in Vietnam, that the United States continuously escalated in Vietnam between the start of the conflict in roughly 1961, the conflict in South Vietnam, I should make clear, in roughly 1961, they continuously escalated and went on escalating up to 1968. They sent first advisors and equipment, then they sent more advisors and more equipment, then they began bombing raids, then they sent ground troops, then they sent more and more ground troops. There were some people in Washington at that time who were deeply skeptical about this process. One of them was President Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy. He famously spoke about escalation, this pattern of escalation as drinking a glass of water. For a short time, you feel better, and then the effect wears off, and you need another. And he was absolutely right. Others who were critical were people like George Bull, who was prominent Kennedy administration official and was, as I've now recently discovered, Jimmy Carter's original choice for Secretary of State when he was elected to the presidency in 1976. So there were critics and skeptics about the policy in the United States, in Washington, then, just as there are critics and skeptics about the policy with respect to Ukraine now. But in all respects, the trajectory has been the same. Every setback is, the response to every setback is further escalation. And of course, the last most momentous act of escalation, based on what we now know, was the decision to launch the Kursk operation in August 2024. We've now learned from the Hill that there was a series of meetings with Ukrainian military intelligence officials. In April 2024, the Ukrainians acknowledged that they were losing the war and that the war would be lost, and it was decided to go for asymmetric warfare, which is another form of escalation. And well, maybe we've seen all sorts of examples of it, all kinds of incidents in Russia, but the main one clearly was the Kursk operation and the attempt to seize the power station. So let us bury this whole idea, this neocon narrative that constantly circulates that we didn't do enough. It's the same story that people who continue to insist that the United States could have prevailed in Vietnam, they continue to make that as well. That is not only a complete rewriting of the actual record of this war. If the wishes of these people were ever fulfilled. It would take us straight to the point of disaster. And besides, what they are really doing, and I think this is the key thing to always understand, what they are really doing is they are constructing for themselves an alibi. They were major advocates of the policy that has played out in Ukraine. That policy has failed. They're looking for someone to blame. They're going to blame the current president of the United States, not because he followed their advice, but supposedly because he didn't follow their advice. He didn't escalate enough. He didn't do more of what they wanted. He did a lot of what they wanted, but he didn't do enough of what they wanted. And we should not give these people that alibi, that space to hide. What they're saying is untrue. My sense is that Poznański and Wolfers in Foreign Affairs are writing in good faith, but it is an alibi that they are supporting simply by trying to counter it in this kind of way, and that is a huge mistake. Anyway, let's move on to other things. I wanted to just finish this program by discussing the really quite extraordinary visit to Syria of the German and French foreign ministers. Now, apparently this visit was unannounced. It's not even clear that the Syrian authorities had much, the new Syrian authorities, even had much notice of it. Anyway, they arrived, the French and German foreign ministers, and it's extremely unclear what it was exactly that they were coming to do. But my own sense is that they came in order to deliver an ultimatum to the new Syrian government, which is basically close down the Russian bases. If the Russian bases aren't closed down, you are not going to get assistance from the EU. Now, I don't think this went down very well, and many people have commented on the fact that there were no handshakes between the new Syrian authorities and the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock. Now, there might have been various reasons for this. There might have been some reluctance, by the way, to shake the hand of a woman. I'm not saying that was so. I don't know what the explanation of this was. But what I think is true is that this ultimatum did not go down well with the new authorities in Syria. And more importantly, it doesn't seem to have gone down very well with Erdogan either. Erdogan, as I said already, has a complex plan of trying to keep the Russians in Syria. The Syrian authorities have been saying this time and again. They've been trying to persuade the Russians to stay in Syria. It is the Russians, up to this time, who've shown a strong inclination to leave. They've dismantled most of the air defences around the air bases. Most of the military personnel have been withdrawn. I gather there are still a few aircraft there, but before long probably they will be redeployed to the new bases that the Russians have rapidly established in eastern and southern Libya, much closer, by the way, to the various locations that in Africa that are supposedly important to them. Just saying. But anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if there's been this attempt by the Syrians to persuade the Russians to stay. The Turks obviously want the Russians to stay. The Russians have not been very keen. And along come the Europeans, and they're sticking their nose into this complex discussion. It is actually very bizarre that the Europeans are doing this. They seem to be under the illusion that the Russians want to stay in Syria. I am not convinced that is the case at all. On the contrary, In fact, I believe that it is the Russians who want to go and the Syrians and the Turks who want them to stay. If the Europeans simply stood by and did nothing, quite possibly the Russians would go of their own accord. The fact that the Europeans are now making it a condition to provide aid to the Syrians that the Russians leave is about the one thing the Europeans might do, could do, which might make the Russians change their minds. I'm not saying that it will, but if it does, well, it would not surprise me. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that tomorrow you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Also, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I'm going to, hopefully, in my program tomorrow, discuss the new economic war, or rather technology war, that is developing between China and the United States. The Chinese are now starting to respond to American sanctions with sanctions of their own, which I suspect are going to be more devastating in the medium term than the American sanctions on China have been. But that's something I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Anyway, this is the end of my program today. We'll see by this evening, probably, we'll have more clarity as to what exactly is happening in Kursk region and what it is that the Ukrainians are up to. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.